Resolutions. This, we have to operate in these continuing resolutions because we don't have a budget. I mean, that's just, I would guess most people in this room, especially if you have a business or you're running your family, have a budget. You have a spending plan. And yet the federal government can't get itself to that point. So I don't think, I understand politics. I understand politics very well. I have my flag vest on. But I think as a nation and in our district, and when you're talking about senior citizens and people who have counted on Medicare and counted on Social Security, and they've paid into it, and they expect it, and they deserve it, this isn't helpful. This is not a discussion about these issues. And somehow, whether we agree or disagree as to what the solution is, we've got to agree to sit down and talk about it. And I would say to the other side, what is your solution? Put something out there. Put something out there so we can sit down and do what we do in Washington. House puts out a bill, Senate puts out a bill, we sit down in a conference and we hash something out, and then we get a compromise. But we can't negotiate with ourselves, and that's the problem that that's the problem we have with so many of the bills we pass out of the House. So I've gone on way long, but now we'll start questions. And we'll go over time with make sure we get enough questions in.
Fantastic. We choose, and I'll read the person's name. You have the option of myself reading the question to the Congresswoman, or you could read the question yourself. And we do have a mic that our Chief Snell will be passing around to accommodate everybody. And please, when you ask, we want everybody here wants to be respectful. As Congresswoman said, we may have different views, but let's try to be respectful in our discussion. And
I back here, so if you have any questions for him, he's
I got a couple for you.
okay, the first question we have is from Ron Fredelis of Fayetteville. Ron? Okay, Ron, would you like me to read the question, or would you like to?
I'd like to.
Okay. Well, since you're right here, I will hand you my microphone.
I think because of your energy this morning, this is a kind of a question I don't need to ask, but are you as excited about representing us for another term as we are?
Thank you very much, Ron. Great question. I noticed not everybody in this room clapped. I love my job. It is such an honor to be the member of Congress and to represent this area, and the people who live in this district are such good Americans. Whether we disagree or agree on issues, everyone loves this country. Everyone wants what's best for this country. Our solutions may look different, but at the end of the day, we're all Americans. We've got an awful lot of tough issues that we have to deal with. But it's just the greatest honor. Every morning, my apartment is about 5 blocks from the Capitol, and you see that Capitol looming in the morning, and you just say, this is the greatest country. This country is what we've achieved in 200 short years, how much we've relied on the people, not the government, but the people. This is a great nation, and the people who live here are great, and I love my job. Thank you very much.
Next we have Josephine Thomas from Syracuse.
Expire at the end of 2012. What will happen to the so-called death tax rate? According to my research, I understand it will mean that any estate over $1 million will be taxed at the federal government rate of 55%, and the New York State rate at 16%, leaving 29% of the individual's estate for the beneficiaries. That, to me, is not taxation, it's confiscation. Do you think Congress will allow this to happen?
Well, I think the tax rates, that whole piece of what's going to happen at the end of this year is of concern to us. And if I'm very honest, I think it's probably going to have to do with which way the election goes in November, who's in office, whether it's in the lame duck Congress, and how they're going to handle it. I think it's no surprise, and it's my position on taxes is that the American people pay enough taxes. I think that those rates should be extended. I think that the estate tax should not go up. I actually think we should reduce corporate taxes. And there's so many issues to talk about when raising taxes, because I mentioned earlier different solutions. Some folks would say we need to raise taxes to address our debt and our deficit. And for those of you that haven't heard this before, you know that our deficits, we run about $1.5 trillion deficit every year, and it accumulates into a national debt of about 16 trillion. So some would say, well, let's raise taxes. Let's just raise taxes to offset those expenses. But I think if you gotta look at that, if we not just raise taxes, but we confiscate the wealth of that top 1%. We take that, we not just bump up there, we take all of the wealth. That only amounts to about $1 trillion. That's not going to scratch the surface when you're looking at a $16 trillion debt. So we've got to look at how this government spends money, and we've got to cut spending. We have no, I think morally, it's reprehensible to put a budget in place that spends more money than we're taking in. That's just a basic, that's not a Republican or Democratic issue. It's irresponsible of this government to spend $1 trillion more every year than we bring in. That starts this. And I want to say something here, because people will say, "Oh, you're a Republican, and you're speaking out against President Obama and his spending." This trend didn't start with President Obama. This trend started long ago when George Bush had the 3 houses and he lost his way and he spent money that we didn't have. This is an ongoing problem. He then had the wars and he had 9/11, and that was a complication. But he spent money that he didn't have as a nation, and he began this trek. This is not something the last 3 years has this is an ongoing problem where this country has spent more money than it's taken in. So I think we need to cut spending. We got to be careful. I mean, it must make you all see when you watch the TSA, or you watch the Secret Service, or you listen to the EPA, the district director there talking about crucifying. I think it must make you see this is the arrogance of Washington. And again, it's not Republican or Democrat. The arrogance of people in these agencies who have no regard for your tax dollars. And you got to keep reminding yourself the government doesn't have a penny. The only money they have is what you give them. And so I think the government owes all of you a much higher regard and a much higher level of accountability for how they're spending your money. And they're doing a lousy job. They're not accountable. There's just a disregard for, and if you've got $100 that someone gave you and it's not your money, you spend it a lot more freely than when you've got $100 and it's your grocery money and it's your gas money and the like. So that's, I think, a big problem. And when you see this irresponsible spending, I have a hard time justifying raising taxes to feed that beast even more. We had a hearing in Oversight Government Reform, and it was the Government Accountability Office, the GAO, came in, and we had just on that day, we happened to be talking about food and shelter programs that the federal government administers. Now, there's not a person in this room who doesn't want to make sure that people are not going hungry and they don't have a place to live. But the GAO sat there and they said to us, we can't tell you how many federal programs there are to address food and shelter programs in this country. We can't tell you how much the nation spends on those programs. And worst of all, they can't tell us the outcomes. They're not measuring outcomes. So they can't tell us whether 80% of the money allocated for this program is going into administrative costs or if it's actually getting to the people who need those services. So when you hear that stuff, you say, okay, how can I justify giving them more money to spend more irresponsibly? And that's, I think, the discussion. I don't think that that's a Republican or Democratic issue. I think that's an American issue about how the government functions. And when I tell you that Washington is broken, it's broken, and it's broken on both sides. The government has gotten too big. There's status quo kind of people on both sides of the aisle who just want to keep the machine running. And they just want to keep feeding the machine, and they don't really look at outcomes. They don't look at how effective services are, how efficient services are. And I think every American, regardless of your political party or your philosophy, needs to be concerned with the way Washington does business. It's broken down there. it's broken every time I listen to, Secretary Chu was in for Oversight of Government Reform, Eric Holder. You listen to the condescension and you listen to the arrogance about, well, we know what's best for the American people. And I think Washington has got a big problem that the American people have got to address.
Question is, any items of interest about your UN assignment, and have you conferred with former Ambassador Bolton on any issues?
To be the congressional delegate to the UN for this year, and I have a counterpart on the Democratic side, Russ Carnahan from Missouri, and so we've been to the UN. We were there when the President spoke, but we also have more access to the UN, more access to the State Department than some of the other members. I think that, this morning we were talking about national security issues, and last night I gave a little talk about national security issues. Although it appears that these wars are winding down, I think right now our nation faces more threats and more uncertainty, especially in the Middle East, but other places in the country as well. We've got Iran, and it's no longer a suspicion. It really is a certainty that they're trying to develop a nuclear weapon. That's of concern. We have what happened in Egypt with Mubarak. When Mubarak was in, yes, he was a dictator, but he was the devil we knew. And now there's so much uncertainty. We've had a number of hearings and briefings on the Muslim Brotherhood, and if they're going to move in, and whether it's a radical element of the Muslim Brotherhood. Some would argue that they're moderate, some would say they're not moderate, and they're going to go back to Sharia law, and they're going to go take the people back through, they get to this democratic process and through one election, and then they're going to revert back to what they were, only worse. You've got Syria, Libya, all of this uncertainty. I think there's a lot of threats. China is another threat. We talked about the debt. We didn't talk about the fact that probably 38 to 40% of our debt is owned by foreign countries. That's a concern. That affects our national security and the strength of who we are. You're less likely to stand up and assert yourself, and as Ronald Reagan would say, peace through strength, when you're beholden to countries for your debt. That puts us in a precarious position. Another good reason why we need to get our spending under control.
Thank you very much for taking my question. The Catholic Church has said that they're not going to abide by Obama's ruling when it comes to abortion. So the question is, I've been watching it very closely, specifically when I go overseas a lot, and it looks like, at least what you're hearing is, even if the Supreme Court rules on the side of Obama and the administration, the Catholic Church isn't going to do it, and they're going to close the hospitals. Because that's the rumors you're hearing. So what impact or what contingency plans are in place as a community if St. Joe's, for example, decides they're going to close and all those beds are not going to be used? I mean, is there a contingency plan that the government has if something like that was to happen?
The concern to many, there's two things I want to say about the HHS rule. Number one, it's not about contraceptives, and number two, it's not about the Catholic Church. It is about the largest assault on our First Amendment rights by the government in the history of the country. It is the government telling an institution, whether they're Catholic or Jewish or Christian or Protestant or Muslim, it is the government telling them that they have to set their conscience aside, set their beliefs aside, and follow what we're telling you to do. So it could be serving pork in a Jewish home. It could be anything. You can fill in the blanks yourself. It is the government overreaching and affecting our First Amendment freedom of religion. Now, with regards to the, you're talking about St. Joe's, and we've had conversations with St. Joe's, the concern. My understanding is that what will happen in St. Joe's, right now St. Joe's has two plans. They have the self-insured plan, which is what you're talking about. And many large institutions do that. They pool their money, and then they just get an administrator to pay their claims. So that's what St. Joe's does. They have another plan where they contract directly with an insurance company, which is another way to have your insurance, which is conventional for a lot of businesses. And there's about 7 people in that program because it's way more expensive than the self-insured plan that St. Joe's has. and her, what